So similar to Indus, Mesopotamia had a multitude of cultures and diversity within its realm, within its civilization. It had long trade distances, which made central organization difficult. So it's trading with Indus, while it brought it great wealth and a variety of materials and products, it also made kind of a strong central government difficult because things tended to be spread out and people were traveling great distances, and so control was much harder to do under those circumstances. So the cities had independent deities, and they also had very distinct political entities. So there's more of an independence or kind of tribal city-state set up versus a strong central government that was handing down orders and organizing everything, including religion. The irrigation canals were important because they really consolidated the power um, in the group that controlled the irrigation, which ended up being the priests. And so the power of the water was associated with the priests, and the priests became kind of organizers of the economy, of labor, as well as religion in the civilization. Um, so the irrigation required greater coordination because it was much more difficult than, say, the Egypt situation, where Egypt just relied on the Nile flooding kind of on its own, and their difficulty was in controlling the floods when they came. But here in Mesopotamia, they were more concerned with building artificial irrigation because they did not have the same sort of flooding cycles that the Nile has. So because of that, the Mesopotamian culture was varied and diverse, again split up into these kind of individual areas. But they did have some of the largest cities in the world at the time because of their location, because of their links with India and the trading, and also because of the wealth of metals that they were mining up in the north, as well as the grain that they were growing on the plains with this irrigation. So this surplus in economy that happened because of the largeness and wealth that the cities had allowed for a more complex, centralized social system to develop, which um, which allowed them to develop this irrigation technology that was necessary for the climate. So if it weren't for the surplus in the economy that led to cultural artifacts like these statues, there would not have been the ability to concentrate on further developing technology for irrigation either. So the ascendancy of the Akkadians and King Sargon had a lasting impact even to today, because he brought the idea of kingship and having authority located in a person rather than having the authority kind of associated with the city or with a larger body of people. Um, and so this really transitioned the individual village-sized settlements um, and the loyalty that people had to those villages to a, um, a loyalty to a single ruler and to a more centralized government and governing style. So this strong administrative center was expressed in palaces that were much larger than we saw in Indus, which Indus had much less emphasis placed on the rulers, whereas here in Mesopotamia, the ruler was the seat of power, and so the place where the ruler lived had to express that and accommodate the things that went along with that. So things like offices and libraries and storage really became necessary to rule from a single seat, a single person, and obviously things like throne rooms and ceremonial spaces became associated with the king versus being in the temples or in the baths like in Indus. The emphasis and the authority now lay in a single person. So one of the bigger cities was Ur, which was located along the Euphrates. In fact, it was located on an island in the Euphrates. But around 2150 BCE, mountain tribes came down and ransacked Ur and kind of stripped away the power that Sargon had. And it became up to the people of the southern region of Mesopotamia, which was dominated by the Sumerians, who actually came before Sargon, to reunite the region. And they did this in the city of Ur. But they continued on with Sargon's innovations of ruling from a central kingship. But what they did is they added a link of the kingship to heaven and then tied it to a specific city. So the cultural fabric became much more complex because people were adding ideas to other people's ideas to other people's ideas about how things ought to be done. And so here in Ur, you've got, again, the king rule, being put into one person or one bloodline, linking that to heaven and tying it to a specific city. And their thinking was that this could move from city to city depending on what was going on. But the priests controlled the land and organized labor for irrigation, as well as managed the economy and infrastructure. And they were able to do this because the kingship was linked to heaven, and the priests were obviously in charge of that connection of the people in the cities to heaven and to the religious ideals of the culture. So this political structure was basically a theocratic socialism where people were working for the city-state, and so that concentrated the power, but it also led to other cultural innovations where the priests developed systems where the deities were assigned to specific activities and the care for individual cities. So over 3,000 gods were associated with objects like tools and building bricks. And so this religion became part of everyday life and really seeped into and seeped into everyday life and really fortified the priests' power and control over everything that happened in their cities. And so the gods lived in the temples versus living in heaven, and then the temples just being kind of the point of contact that people had. And so places like the ziggurat at Ur became very important. The religion was heavy in superstition, but they also believed that life after death was basically sad and a pitiable state. So burial architecture was not that common because death was just not a good thing, and it wasn't that you were preparing people for the afterlife like the Egyptians were big on mummifying and putting in necessary materials and food for the afterlife. Here it was much more you're living on earth, and your association and your relationship with the gods were what you're really concentrated on, not going to some better place after you perform good deeds on earth. So this um, this burial architecture then that we see in like the pyramids of Egypt and in other places uh, was not a centralized idea of the culture. But the ziggurat um, actually was much more of um, maybe an everyday place, um, not just again a point of contact with the gods. In fact, it was even seen as a conjugal place where marriages were consummated, and it was tied to fertility that was bestowed by the gods. So again, it provides this kind of direct link to the gods and developing a relationship with the gods, and not waiting until the afterlife to have that connection. So the building itself was similar maybe to a pyramid in that it was a mound and everything, but it was actually very different than the pyramids in a lot of sense. So it was surrounded by walls. Go back here. It was surrounded by walls with an adjacent law court. So again, kind of tying the necessity of everyday activities to the centralized control of the priests. But it had three monumental staircases that went up to a platform about 60 feet above the ground. The walls were smooth and refined plaster walls with painted narratives explaining how how people were connected to the gods and providing a narrative for the gods and their interactions between themselves and to the people on Earth. And you can see that the building was made up of individual flat bricks, just stacked up, but on a very monumental scale. So there were three tiers. The first bottom tier was painted white for the god Apsu, who was the god of waters. And in their narrative, Ea um, who was represented by the second tier, which was painted black, was seen as floating on water and dominating water because he defeated Apsu in battle. And then the top represented the flaming air, the light from the sun, bringing brightness to the world. But then there are also blue tiles on the walls that represented blue heaven and the space above Earth. So they were seeing the Earth as being organized through the gods, but also by the colors and things like the life-giving light and representing those in architectural form. So the massing of these buildings were no longer just representations of geographical entities like mountains. They were not trying to build mountains. What they were doing is they were building abstract representations of ideas of ordering life and of culture. And so this sort of architectural abstraction instead of geometric or geographic organization is a significant break, and may even kind of be the beginning of modern architecture, where you're thinking about massing and planes and items in the architecture as representations of things versus just recreations of what's going on in the world. So these temples, the city and everything were built with slaves. And again, it was those square, flat bricks that was mortared with bitumen, which is a water sealant, which the Indus used in creating their baths. So the technology was advancing, but it was still dependent on a slave class in order to actually construct and provide the labor on such a massive scale for things. But this was made possible because they had the economic excess of being situated in a good place, having established trade routes, and then having the centralized organizing structure of the priests in order to be able to carry out these larger projects. And so the city of Ur itself was in between two branches of the Euphrates, so a very picturesque site, close to water, made defense easier, had many advantages. The city itself was an oval shape that again had this unique location of being tied directly to the Euphrates, having a canal that encircled the walls, providing good defense. But the high walls were there just as much to impress with their power and as a symbol as they were for actual security from marauders or from enemies. And then ringing these walls were orchards and gardens, and then the agriculture growing wheat and other food stretched beyond that, so that when you're up on the walls, you had kind of this tremendous view of the power and the organization of the priesthood class that made all of this possible. So today we're going to pick up around 2500 BCE. We're talking about what happened previous to this in the 3500 to 2500 BC era. Civilization was really just coming to grips with accommodating basic needs like food and shelter. They started understanding materials for buildings, started to understand farming techniques, started to develop ways of passing this information along to future generations. And now, by 2500 BCE, civilizations were really primed for cultural development because they'd gotten a hang of these very basic needs and necessities and were able to take care of themselves. And now it was time to start, doing something with it and pushing ahead and progressing. So food and shelter was pretty much taken care of by now. And people were really starting to concentrate on developing the culture of the individual areas. Now, there were 5 cultural hubs at this time. It was China, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Margiana, and Indus. And we're going to start talking about Indus to begin with. So Indus is just the area around kind of present-day India, the Indus Valley. Again, lots of these civilizations developed around rivers or oceans along shores because of the abundance of food and water. But especially in Indus, the civilizations were really organized around water. Water became kind of their central location for developing their culture. But the Indus had trade associations with Mesopotamia. And so you had areas of urbanization at either end of this relationship, and then some in between kind of supporting this interconnectedness. But this was really an area that started to flourish because there was so much trade, and it's referred to as the zone of interconnectedness or the intercommunication zone because there was a lot of trade and a lot of travel moving back and forth around this. So one of the consequences of water being a central element of culture is that there weren't these ziggurats or pyramids that appeared as kind of the high point of what a culture was developing. But it was more about the water, more about the public baths, which really became the center of culture. And so the Indus were associated with the Indus River and the Gagar Hakra River, Again, close source of food and water. But there were several settlements that sprang up around this area. In fact, there are over 1,000 cities located in this 250,000-mile area. There was a common language with standard weights and measures, so trading with the civilizations in Mesopotamia became really easy and became commonplace. Ships carried bricks and beads, lumber, metals, and lapis lazuli to Mesopotamia, but we don't really know what was traded coming back because there's nothing, there's no evidence left supporting any sort of speculation on what they may have traded in return. But there was really an increase in trade and communication between these civilizations, which also helped both civilizations define themselves and learn and grow. Now, bricks were very important to the Indus region. Not only did they trade them with Mesopotamia as a source of revenue, but they were used as the basis for their cities. They were not only used for protection in building walls, but they raised up the cities to protect them from flooding. Again, being close to rivers, obviously there's going to be a preponderance of flooding and problems associated with seasonal changes in rainfall, etc. And so raising the cities up off the ground obviously benefited that as well. And then the walls also just protected them from the water if it rose too high. They also had a very intricate stormwater management system. Obviously, this was of great importance to them, just to get the water out in case they did get flooded. But if you compare it to today's city of Austin with the detention and retention ponds and the very strict stormwater management that happens in Austin, you kind of get a sense of how that defines the culture and what it does to the built environment because you have these structures in place. So the cities were divided into upper and lower regions. The upper regions were where the palaces and ceremonial spaces were, and they often had their own walls. And then the lower regions had the housing. So if you compare it to cities of today, you have concentrations of things like museums and the nicer homes and everything tend to be off by themselves, and then the housing and the lower classes tend to be off on their own in different areas. So there was a strong ruling class, and these were reflected, of course, in the building sizes and qualities, just like today. And then the locations were separated as well. But there are no large centers of power, and so there were no big temples or castles or palaces. They were just some houses were larger than others, but there were none of these grand palaces that we would see in other areas. And there was no centralized religious structure. A lot of the iconography and religious symbols had to do with animals and varying symbols, but there was no real centralized iconography or representation of religious ideas because there were no centralized religious structures in place. And then when the Gagar Hakra dried up, it became a lake, and then the lake dried up, and they abandoned the city. So the cities, even today, you'll see an ebb and flow in cities depending on situations, and this happened back then as well. Right now, we are experiencing some changes in our climate, and certain areas are becoming wetter, certain areas are becoming drier, hotter and colder, etc. And that may lead to different emphasis on different cities depending on what the cities are based on. So one of the dominant cities in the Indus region was the Mohenjo-Daro. And here you can see a plan of the upper town, which included the great baths right in the center, and other things like the granary and the college, the stupa, kind of linked but grouped around this great bath, again indicating the centralized importance of what was going on there. Um, so the largest buildings were raised to avoid the flash floods from the Himalayan mountains, from snow melt and ice melt. But they collected this water, which was pretty smart, and used it for the drier times of the year. But then something interesting about how it was laid out. Looking at this image, you can see that the roadways or the pathways were pretty blank, and that it was actually coming off into these little side areas where you started to enter into neighborhoods, and kind of more protected areas, more sealed off areas. And so this whole block, looks like a neighborhood, but it's kind of blank on each side. But as you get inside, if you notice the structures where we get actually large courtyards and whatnot, that start to become this kind of centralized gathering area for each household. Now they often had second stories. First story would be made out of brick, and then the second story would be made out of wood. Now going back to the Great Bath, this was the social center of the city. They used bricks to create the baths themselves, and they used waterproofing on here to hold the water. So it's starting to become a pretty sophisticated material and building methods civilization, where they're able to define what they needed and find solutions in technology to create those. And what's interesting about the baths is that this also included, near the entrance area, ritual urns, which were probably of the elite or very important people. So again, it's tying the importance of what's happening in the culture to these baths and to water. And so just kind of further showing how the Indus region was really defined by water and the relationship to it. And so next we come to Egypt. Egypt was in a very particular situation, very advantageous situation, where it was less prone to invasions, and so it was more stable and able to have a more consistent set of religious beliefs. Religion is a driving force behind civilization, so lots of architecture is dedicated to it, and it had definitely had a great effect on the Egyptians. Their religious beliefs were all caught up in the architecture that we study and that's still around today that we have to look at. One of the things that really helped Egypt is that they had seasonal farming, which meant they had time in the off season to do projects for the pharaohs. The workforce was completely dedicated to building special projects for the pharaohs during the off seasons. With their complexity of cosmology, they were able to translate that into the complexity of the temples, and they really fit their cosmology to their culture and economy. So working hand in hand between the very practical nature of cultural taboos, mores, practices, as well as the economic factors that determined how the civilization was progressing, those things were locked and intertwined deeply into the cosmology and the religion of the day. So, what the central pharaohs were able to do was organize this really vast and efficient workforce. They had a political unity of the region that allowed them to dedicate resources and choose specific projects to work on that were much grander than some of the other civilizations that we saw that didn't have all of these advantages. Now, as a consequence, workers had little contact with the rulers or the religious practices of the elite. It was a very separated society where the economic prosperity obviously went to the very top elite peoples. The economic prosperity was so great that they were able to produce 3 times the needed output um, for trade with other people, for gathering these extra resources and profit that could be used for these royal projects like the pyramids. There was also lots of stone along the Nile Valley. There was red granite and white marble, black basalt, and soft sandstone that all made excellent building materials for different types of buildings and uses. Because of the excess of profit and the ability for the pharaohs to choose projects that were above and beyond just everyday needs, the buildings became symbols of power, and they became symbols of the pharaohs themselves that were building them. So in the tomb of Zoser, one of the pharaohs, just for instance, it was made specifically for rituals during the reign of Zoser. It was a place to make offerings, and it was really a preparation for Zoser's eternal life. Now, what happened during this time is that there was a shift in the idea of death and religious practices, where rulers now ranked among the gods. So the pyramids started to take on more and more importance, and of course had to be larger and more magnificent in order to reflect this change in attitude between rulers and the gods. So the word for tomb actually meant house of eternity. And then when the pyramids came along, the pyramids came to mean a place where one ascends. So hence the kind of stepped pyramid of Zoser's tomb, and the kind of ziggurat-like nature of it. They were trying to emulate the idea of steps up to heaven and to the afterworld. So the step nature of the walls was a a particular feature of Zoser's tomb. Whereas later on there were still the steps, but they weren't as exaggerated as they were in that first pyramid. But the idea of the pyramid was to not only protect the king, but again to assist in his ascension towards the afterlife. And during all this, people had to keep watch, or the gods had to keep watch over what was happening in the ritualized spaces. And so the organization and the metaphorical nature and the symbols of what was going on were very important to the builders of this type of architecture, down to details and columns and decoration on the building. Now, Giza was really the epitome of pyramid building in Egypt, because it was here that it really became kind of a game of one-upmanship for the biggest and best pyramids. You can see a comparison of the Zoser pyramid with the later pyramids, where each pyramid had to be bigger and better than the other one. And during this time, there were several failures and kind of advancements in how these pyramids were put together in order to achieve greater heights and greater prestige for the pharaohs who built them. So this entire complex of Giza is really quite fascinating and well worth a visit today. Now, when these pyramids were first built, they were actually in a very dense urban fabric. So it's a little bit different than today, where the edge of the city kind of comes up to to the complex, but stops, and you have a backdrop of empty desert. So it's a little different today than it was then, but definitely the power that these things symbolized, the notion that these rulers were equal with gods. All of this really affected the way the architecture was approached, and the way that it was carried out. Now, not to be left out, the Americas, particularly South America, had a lot going on at the time. The Andean population down in modern-day Peru was placed right between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, and found this little niche in the South American wilderness along these rivers, again, very typical like other civilizations, where they could kind of eke out a living and survive off the food and the building materials that were available to them. Their developments were very similar to what was happening in the rest of the civilized world at the time. Diagrams of their places of ritual were very similar, with the stepped pyramids, like we saw in Egypt, the grouping of buildings, the hierarchy that was established with the priests, and political power and organization of labor. So don't discount what was happening all the way over in South America. In fact, the amount of archaeological information that's still buried is enormous. It'll take many years of excavation and study to start to understand really what was going on in South America at this time. Because things hadn't been or haven't been so well documented and investigated as of yet, we tend to forget about what was going on in South America. But if you look at the plans of the places that we have discovered and have uncovered and started to study, they're very much like what was happening in the rest of the world. And so it really should be thought of as a parallel development in what was happening in all these other cultures and civilizations that we've been talking about. Same thing in Europe. Europe didn't have pyramids, but they had some equally impressive structures that were built there. The civilization there was advanced in maybe little different ways. There wasn't the vast labor and economic resources available, but they were doing their own kind of thinking, and so Stonehenge is one of those places that really best represents what was happening in the whole of Europe at the time. Stonehenge is one of the preeminent sites in Europe. Just an amazing place. I've been there a couple of times, and to think that back in 2500 BCE to 2000 BCE, there were groups of people on the British plains that were able to manipulate these large stones in such a way as to bring both meaning and utility to their everyday lives. Now, Stonehenge has been wrecked by the Romans when they were suppressing the local cultures. It's been damaged by tourists. It's been bought and sold, and now it's finally, since about World War I, has been owned and maintained by the country of England. So now it's back in the realm of the public, so that we'll hopefully have reference to the site forever. Now, it's undergone several transformations, altering the use and meaning, but today it's much in the state of what it was like back when the city of Ur in Mesopotamia was at its height. So just kind of for comparison. And it's not a primitive structure as it may look. It's actually a very advanced Bronze Age structure. Um, the people, the Beaker people, who came in and made adjustments to it later on, were very precise and very exacting in how they manipulated the stones and the site. So don't take it for an ancient, unsophisticated ruin. It actually has a lot of extremely impressive mathematical and precision building techniques that had it come about. So the Beaker people came along after Stonehenge was first established, um, and they either came from Spain or the Balkans. It's not really sure which, but they brought their metalworking knowledge with them to England, and when they were there, they reoriented Stonehenge from a lunar marker or monument to a solar monument. Um, and one of the big reasons for that is because they worship the sun and how the sun had a relationship to their metalworking, to the smelting of the metal, and the ability for them to shape and craft metal was closely tied to fire, and therefore the sun in their eyes. So they also changed it from just a local temple to really a focal point for the larger civilization. So it became a much more important monument during their time. As I said, the monument itself is extremely precise from when it was first built, and also from the adjustments and changes later on. That there was lots to the working of the stone, which was very unique. The ability of the Beaker people to shape these large stones to within 10 centimeters of being horizontal around the entire monument is pretty amazing right now. Thinking about it, if you had to do this without the use of power tools and laser levels, could you get it as exact and as precise as they were able to? Now, it did go under many changes during the year, starting out as just an earthen bank and ditch that again was tied to the the lunar cycles and how people were connected with the moon. And then several additions were made over the years, different orientations for lining up with the lunar cycles. And then finally with the Beaker people adding in their orientation to the sun, which shifted it just a few degrees, but turned it into an entirely different type of ritual and different type of monument out on the Salisbury Plains. But because of climatic cooling, the civilization that was using this as a focal point for its cultural activities really devolved into a hamlet society, and they didn't build any other really significant works of architecture. And so this is all we have left of a civilization that was really changed and wiped out really because of the way the climate changed during their time. So these were very different civilizations, all tied to their geography, tied to their economies, tied to their religious beliefs, and they all manifested these different sets of criteria and constraints and belief systems into different and unique types of architecture, although they're basically all the same. They had varying amounts of priorities set on these different goals that they had in mind that came from their different and unique situations of geography or beliefs or materials that were available to them.